Hey everyone, before we begin today, we have a message from shark scientist and friend of Wild Green Memes, Dr. David Shiffman.
A message from one of at least 74 practicing shark researchers in Wild Green Memes for Ecological Fiends. Hello, Ecological Fiends! This is David Shiffman, and I am here to offer you the chance to be a practicing shark researcher for the day. If you join one of our fundraiser charters, you will help my shark research team out of Miami, Florida, to catch, measure, tag, and sample sharks, all while raising money for the lab to bring high school students and middle school students from underserved school districts out in the future. We have spots available right now on May 9th and 10th. You can find me on Instagram at WhySharksMatter to learn more, and we're always available to book a whole group charter if you provide a group of up to 15 people. The only requirement is you have to be at least 16 years old. Hope to see you out there on the water. Thanks for your support.
Is the best shark with its inner dorsal ridge. Shiffman is the fishman. The sandbar is his friend, along with at least 74 currently practicing shark researchers.
You can find links to everything mentioned above in the description of this episode. This is Wild Green Streams. I'm Rhett.
I'm Io.
And our guest today is journalist, writer, Florida man, host of the Welcome to Florida podcast, His Majesty, Craig Pittman. Craig, welcome to the pod.
Thanks very much, and you can stop bowing now.
If you insist.
Sure, one more. So Florida often gets a bad rap, and it's the butt of many a joke, but it really is an incredible and unique place. What do you think is the number one thing people get wrong about Florida, and what do you think everyone should know about the Sunshine State?
The number one everybody gets wrong about Florida is that not everyone has an outstanding warrant. And the number one thing that people should know is that there are a lot of us who, even though we own machetes, we don't necessarily use them in improper ways. That not every Florida man is like, say, Matt Gaetz. That there are examples of Florida men in history, for instance, who did good things. For instance, John Adanasoff, who grew up in Polk County and went on to invent the first computer. So, there are good things.
That's crazy.
Kind of made your career around writing several books about Florida. You've worked for newspapers for a long time. And so growing up in Florida, lots of people, grow up in a place but never develop a serious attachment necessarily to where they're from. So what is it about Florida that just so drew you into the place that you were living and grew up in?
Well, I grew up in the Panhandle. I grew up in Pensacola, and if you're familiar with Pensacola, people in Pensacola tend to look at the rest of the state like it's a foreign country. They feel like they're closer to Alabama, although really they're not. They are very much part of Florida. But when I moved from Pensacola down to the Sarasota area, I suddenly discovered, number one, that the Gulf of Mexico was in the wrong place, and it took me about a year to get used to that. But number two, that there was a whole history and culture to the place that I was not aware of, and at that point I started really reading up on Florida history, getting to know people, talking to people, going places, and the more I learned, the more fascinated I became, and I'm still learning today. That was in the 80s, and I'm still learning stuff I didn't know today. So to me, Florida is the gift that keeps on giving. There are great things about Florida. I highly recommend our state park system, which has won 4 national awards, which is 3 more than any other state has won.
Wow, I didn't even know that.
Yeah, we've got some of the best beaches in the country, and of course we have the best police log items too. So I think people should really embrace that stuff, embrace the fact that Florida is very special, and a lot of what makes it special is in the environment, in the biology of the place, and they should treasure that. And I'm heartened when I see people respond to threats like the story that erupted this past fall, where the governor wanted to put golf courses in the state parks, and people in both parties came out screaming bloody murder say, "Don't you dare."
Oh, yeah, that was insane. Anytime you see Rick Scott coming out for the state parks, that's a weird situation.
Oh, yeah, since he tried it first.
Right, yeah. Let's put that aside for a second.
Yeah.
But, do you mind just telling people about that? Because I know this is a huge thing for us Floridians, but I know some people from Australia might not have heard about it.
Okay, so this veterans group called Folds of Honor met with several Florida politicians to say, hey, we want to build golf courses in Jonathan Dickinson State Park. It's a former military site there, so we think it'd be great, and we'd have this golf location, and we'd be raising money to give scholarships to the children of disabled veterans. And isn't that great? And the two politicians they met with from Martin County, one I think was a Martin County commissioner, and one was the state senator named Gail Harrell, both told him, "You're insane, get out of my office." Basically, don't you dare touch our state park. But then they went and met with Governor DeSantis, or as I call him, Governor Disastrous. And he was like, yeah, that sounds cool. Let's do it. And so the DEP started putting together this plan to put not one, not two, but 3 golf courses in Jonathan Dickinson State Park in habitat for the rare Florida scrub jay. Jack Nicklaus himself went and surveyed the property and said, oh, yeah, this would work, and I'd be happy to design the golf course. And the DEP came up with this very elaborate plan where they weren't just going to put golf courses in this one state park. They started talking about building pickleball courts in some of the state parks and 350-room hotels in some of the other state parks. And it's just crazy. This is not stuff that people want from their state parks. They want to get away from this kind of development. That's the whole point of the state park system. And so, the slogan of the state parks is "See the real Florida." Well, I'm sorry, golf courses and hotels and pickleball, that's not the real Florida. And so the DEP, being directed by the governor's office, they were trying to sneak it through the leadership of the DEP. The rangers in charge of these parks didn't even know what was going on. And when a member of the DEP staff who was in the mapping department was the one charged with, drawing up the maps for where this stuff would go. And he felt really, really uneasy with it. And he ended up leaking it to another DEP staffer who leaked it to a former DEP staffer who then spread it all over the place. And it immediately blew up. The first big story was in the Tampa Bay Times, my old newspaper. Hats off to Max Chesney's for breaking the news. And it just spread like wildfire. And soon there were big crowds of people protesting in Tallahassee and at the various parks, especially at Jonathan Dickinson, and screaming, basically, "You leave my park alone." Because people... It's very heartening. People feel this ownership for their particular state park. If it's one in their neighborhood, if it's in their town, they think that's my state park. How dare you try and mess this up? And so finally, when it all broke, the governor was actually in Ireland, and all the ire was raining down over here. But he came back and I guess finally felt like he had to address this. He was holding a press conference on something else, and reporters asked him, "What are you going to do about the state parks thing?" And he said, "Well, it was a half-baked idea. I had nothing to do with it. That wasn't me." And of course, now we know from seeing the public records, yeah, he was part of it. This was all done at his behest. And he said, if people don't like it, that's fine. We'll shelve this. We'll put it on the back burner for this year. So that doesn't mean it's over. That just means they're going to pull it back for now.
Right.
The Folds of Honor people, to their credit, said, okay, if it's this controversial, we won't do it. But, that doesn't mean somebody else can't. And now there are bills in the legislature to prevent golf courses from ever being built in state parks,
Beautiful.
which is probably what should have happened when Rick Scott was governor. Because when Scott was governor, he and Jack Nicklaus, there he comes again, cooked up this idea for the Jack Nicklaus Golf Trail that would be in 5 state parks. And there would be hotels built to serve the golf courses that would be part of the state park system. And when those bills were introduced in the legislature to create the Jack Nicklaus Golf Trail, Arnold Palmer himself came out and said, "This is the stupidest idea I've ever heard of."
That's how you know.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember hearing when the story broke, I just thought, first of all, this can't be real. And then I thought,
Yeah.
of course it's real and this is ridiculous. And immediately, because being from Florida, still having so many connections with Florida, even though I'm no longer in the state, everyone I know up in arms, people in other countries who knew me and everything were like, this is insane. And so, I mean, petitions everywhere. I saw everyone talking about it. And I was honestly very pleasantly surprised at the level of pushback that it got, because of course I thought it deserved that much pushback. But you know, so often you can feel hopeless sometimes when people don't care. And I was like, because I of course care so much about the state parks and, you know, nature in general. And so seeing so many other people care about it at the same level that I did, I was like, these are, you know, thousands of people across the state that I've never met, but we are connected in this way.
Yes.
Of caring about art, and for, you know, and as you were saying, everyone's different local state park. Everyone has that one park that is for them, you know, theirs, and that's the one that they're fighting for. And you could be championing a different state park, and because Florida is so diverse, the state parks can be incredibly different.
Oh yeah, definitely.
It's still like a united front in this way, and it was like, wow, I'm really proud of my state and all the people who live there who like really got this really united, unanimous pushback on this thing. Because, you know, you can go golfing anywhere, but you can't go to Florida state parks anywhere.
There's a golf course that borders Jonathan Dickinson State Park. You can see it from the park.
I'm sure they were happy about the potential competition. Let me tell you 2 more stories. One is when the Rick Scott thing was going on, they were also talking about expanding all kinds of other stuff in the parks. And one of the proposals was to open up Honeymoon Island State Park, which is the most popular state park in the system, to open it up to overnight camping and to RV camping. And yeah, exactly. And they held a public hearing on this, and Governor Scott, and this was hugely controversial. People in Dunedin hated the idea, and Scott was in St. Petersburg for a big speech, and I cornered him and said, "Do you support this?" And he's like, "Yes, this is a great idea. This will get more people out there to the parks. Isn't this wonderful?" And they held the public hearing, and 1,000 people turned out, and 999 were opposed to it. And they were actually talking about linking arms and blocking the roads going in case the RVs showed up, or lying down in the road. And the people who did the public hearing recommended we should drop this. And like a day later, Scott was like, "Okay, I'm opposed to this now." and we won't do this. And I mean, all of the stuff, all the changes that were proposed while he was governor wound up backfiring. You know, that they were going to let people hunt in the state parks. They were going to let cattle graze in the state parks. All went out the window. So
yeah. For people who, I guess in some places, state parks are kind of have a different setup than ours. Yeah. But yeah, like in Florida, they're kind of the same idea as like a national park. Like they're like a mini national park, except some of them are like 50 miles too. So they're not that small. But the point is essentially preservation with human access, but not pickleball.
Yeah. And the interesting thing to me is if you look at the history of them, you know, a lot of them were built in the 30s and were built with the help of the national park system. And so that's why they're set up so well, and they're so professionally laid out and so forth. The other thing I was going to tell you is whenever the environment is on the ballot in Florida, people asked to tax themselves in order to buy more property, preserve, and that kind of thing, it usually passes by a huge margin. And even in places that go, bonkers for the politicians who are not valuing this land, people recognize the need to preserve land from the rampant development that's going on here. And to me, that's a really heartening thing as well. And I wish our politicians would recognize that and cherish it too.
It's really nice to have that, that unifying thing of, we all recognize, most of us anyway, recognize how unique and valuable that the Florida ecosystem is, and that it's worth preserving. And hearing sometimes, because rarely do you interface with, thousands or hundreds of thousands of people who live across the state, because of course you can't talk to that many people, but seeing the public outcry and voting for it, it's like, oh yeah, that's really cool to know that everyone else cares about this as much as I do. And it's very hopeful.
Oh yeah, definitely.
You wrote a book about Florida Panthers.
Yes. It was a labor of love, emphasis on the labor part.
As so often has what happens.
I think a lot of people know that Florida Panthers exist, but something that I only learned relatively recently, and I feel like not a lot of people know, is that it was once thought to be extinct. What's the story of their rediscovery?
Well, when they were popular for hunters. Hunters would come from around the country to, it was like going to Africa and killing a lion. I went to Florida and shot a panther. Aren't I a tough macho guy? Mm-hmm. Until in 1958,
in the country, but yeah,
until in 1958, Florida Game Commission, as it was then known, said, "We're worried we're not going to have any panthers left. Stop hunting them," and they actually put them off limits to hunters, which, glory be, who thought they'd ever do that. And so when the Endangered Species Act passed in, 73, and was co-written by a Florida man, a guy named Nat Reed from Jupiter area, who was Deputy Secretary of the Interior at the time. When the Endangered Species Act and the list came out, Florida game officials said, well, you're too late. You're too late to save the panther. They're gone. They're extinct. We don't have any anymore. And the World Wildlife Fund didn't believe them. And they actually found a legendary hunter from Texas named Roy McBride and hired him to come to Florida, bring his hunting dogs, and see if there were any panthers left. And so Roy, who is used to the mountains and the desert and, packs up his dogs and brings them to Florida and turns them loose in the swamps around Lake Okeechobee. And sure enough, he finds one very scrawny female panther and signs that there are a few more, not a lot, but a few. And so he makes his report that, yes, there are still panthers. They're in danger. There's not a lot of them, but yes, they're still there. And so the World Wildlife Fund tells the Game Commission, and the Game Commission says, okay, then I guess we better have someone in charge of saving them. And they appointed a guy who had never seen a panther before in his life, but he was a wildlife biologist and an expert on bears. So they figured, big mammals, it's a bear, panther. Yeah. And he did a really good job, and unfortunately spoke his mind, which cost him the job at some point. Mm-hmm. The first thing he did was he went back to McBride and said, show me how to find panthers. And so McBride trained him in how to do that. And it was his idea that this was a really new technique at the time to capture the panther and put radio collars on them and then track them using their radio signals, because they're very wide-ranging predators. The males in particular, they range very widely. And so they radio collared the panthers and started tracking them to see where they lived. And it's interesting. He went around the state making speeches about how he's looking for panthers, and everywhere he would make a speech, the local paper would run a story, and they'd run this beautiful picture of a panther. And a lot of people didn't know that panthers existed in Florida because there weren't that many then. And it really caught people's attention and caught their imagination. And so about that time, the Florida Education Commissioner, a guy named Ralph Turlington, was running this thing where he thought this would be a great idea to have the school children pick a Florida state animal And he sent out ballots, and he included the panther on the ballot with the alligator and the manatee and some other stuff. And, you know, kids being kids, there were some write-in votes for monkeys. But
That's from the Ocala area.
a huge
Silver Springs.
Oh, yeah. By a wide margin, they picked the panther as the state animal. And so then Turlington sent that to the legislature and said, hey, you want to make this official? And one legislator in particular balked at it and said, no, everybody knows our state animal is the alligator. And he was bombarded with phone calls and telegrams from parents saying, how dare you try and overturn what our kids did? And so the legislature actually made it official. The Florida panther is Florida's official state animal. And I contend that that's the reason they didn't let it go extinct, because it would be really embarrassing if your state animal suddenly went extinct. I mean, it'd be like the governor's limousine being stolen, you know?
Do you think that the positive effect from that is part of why they refused to make the scrub jay the state bird? Because it's interesting because it had the same kind of kid backing and all this stuff, and then they didn't do it.
That was the NRA's lobbyist, a woman named... I'm drawing a blank on her name. Marion Hammer. How could I forget that? Marion Hammer, very powerful lobbyist, you know, representing the NRA, of course. Sure. And Marion Hammer loves mockingbirds. And the mockingbird has been Florida's state bird since 1927. Of course, other states copied us, you know, in the spirit of the mockingbird. They imitated us and picked the mockingbird for their state bird as well. And so when all these, you know, I think it was 20,000 school children wanted the scrub jay, 30,000 voted, several years later, 30,000 voted for the osprey. And each time it came up in the legislature, Marion Hammer would basically say, no, I don't like those. And she actually said the scrub jay exhibited a welfare mentality because it would land on your hand and take food out of your hand. And so, and she stopped it, single-handedly stopped it. And she's now retired. And so there is a bill in the legislature this year to once again get rid of the mockingbird and make the scrub jay our state bird. I'm sorry, to make the scrub jay our state songbird and make the flamingo our state bird. So we'll see what happens with it.
Well, now that it's gotten the wild green plug, obviously it's going to pass. But,
I have always been a proponent of the scrub jay being the state bird because an endemic bird. I mean, how could you not? And it's unique to the Florida scrub, which is an endemic habitat. And if people don't know what endemic means, it means it's only found here. So you can only find Florida scrub in Florida. You can only find Florida scrub jays in Florida. And they're such cool, unique birds. They're so intelligent
and friendly and very strong familial bonds. Young from one year will help to raise the young from the next year. And so I was like, why isn't this a state bird? And then learning, I was like, I can't believe that it's just one person who's been shutting it down this whole time. So hopefully now we have a chance, though. But flamingo to be the state bird is very interesting. I love that. Isn't that cool? And you know, there was some disagreement a few years ago about whether they were natives to Florida or if they were brought in by, you know, because the most famous flock is the one at the Hialeah racetrack. But then the hurricanes actually swept some in here, and they stayed. And so there are about 100 wild flamingos in Florida now. I think they counted 101. And so there's been this push to make them our state bird. And of course, you know, they decorate so many people's shirts and front lawns. I think it's great timing with them kind of re-expanding their range into Florida, but I wish that we would make the lawn flamingo our state bird. Oh, that would be good. You know, our state bird is actually the construction crane. So, I saw a few of those outside my window today. But yeah, they travel in flocks, and you know, really this time of year. Right. But what's the weirdest Florida man or Florida woman wildlife story you've written about? Oh gosh, what a plethora to choose from. Yeah, I mean, well, I mean. There's so many to choose from. Probably it's the giant African land snails. We're including invasives, right? We can include invasives. Yes. Yeah. There was a religious cult in Miami that thought that drinking the mucus from a giant African land snail would make you healthy, and so they smuggled a bunch of them in here from Nigeria, and they unfortunately got loose. And so the snails are popping up all over Miami, and the authorities are freaking out about it. And the people from the cult drink the mucus, and because they think it would make them healthy, actually has the opposite effect. So they show up at the ER, and that's how the officials found out where the snails were coming from. They found out where the ground zero was. And the agriculture department people in particular were freaking out because these snails, they're as big as your hand. They're hermaphroditic, so there's nothing that bars them from breeding very wildly. They will eat 500 different types of fruits and vegetables, many of them commercially valuable, which is why the ag people freaked out. They'll actually strip the stucco off the walls of your home.
Oh my God.
Whoa, I didn't know that.
They're very destructive. And so the Florida Department of Agriculture actually bought and trained dogs to sniff out the snail mucus.
Wow.
And so they would track the snails down and capture them, put them in buckets, then put them in a freezer to kill them. And I always felt bad for the dogs. I figured that they go back to the kennel at night, and the other dogs are bragging, "Hey, I sniffed out some drugs today. How about you? Oh, I sniffed out a bomb. How about you?
I
sniffed out some snail mucus. I sniffed out some snail mucus." It's a living. But I love the idea of this cult smuggling the snails in. One woman apparently had 9 of them under her dress on board an airplane.
Wow.
And I picture the guy sitting in the seat next to her going, "Ma'am, did you know your dress is slowly undulating?"
Yeah, as you said, they are enormous. If you haven't seen what these snails look like, you should look them up because they are
they're gigantic. I mean, it's in the name, giant African land snails.
Yeah, and you think like, oh, I see my garden snails, like something pretty big. Like, no, they're very, very large.
Yeah. I went to there's a USDA facility at the Deering Estate in Miami, and I went there, and they actually had several of them there that they were using to train the dogs. So I put on a glove and held one in my hand, and holy cow, it's just huge. And the little eye stalks were going up and down the whole time. It was freaky, very freaky.
And so funny to think of an animal that we typically perceive as slow, not a very good disperser, to become an invasive species. To think like, everyone's like, oh, snails are slow. Like you could catch them, no problem. To think they're just that prolific enough to become widespread enough to become a problem.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And so they actually managed to get rid of the ones in Miami, and the state, had like a big celebration. Woohoo! We succeeded in extirpating the threat. And then a bunch of them popped up in Pasco County on the other side of the state.
Of course. Yeah.
And then they popped up in Broward County. So now they're dealing with it on both coasts of Florida. So
the snails are just going on a little tour of Florida.
Yeah, exactly. I think they're riding on the back of the pythons. That's my theory.
Ooh, there you go. They've been teaming up, and now they're more powerful. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And in terms of other, crazy environmental stories, you also wrote a book about a very rare orchid and the sort of criminal black market goings on about that, and which to people who are not very familiar, the orchid market can be very pricey, but this one in particular was top of the list.
It was going for $10,000 a plant at the Redlands Orchid Festival. It was from Peru, and this guy who wanted to be famous for discovering orchids, he went and got one in Peru and smuggled it back into the Miami airport in his suitcase with his dirty underwear and everything. And the customs people just waved him right through. They didn't check. And he made a beeline for Selby Botanical Gardens in Sarasota, which was set up just to study orchids. And one of the scientists there had actually seen one for sale at the Redlands for $10,000 and actually thought about, okay, what's my credit card limit? He almost bought one. And then this guy walks in and he's holding the thing they'd talked about, this magnificent purple orchid that stands like a foot high, and says, I only have one condition. I want you to name it after me. And so they took pictures, they did sketches, rushed it into print, and named it after the guy who brought it in, the Phragmipedium cavachii, named after this guy named Kovac, which was tantamount to hanging a sign on his back saying, "Please come arrest me."
Yeah, that's what my thought was. You're not being very subtle or covering your tracks when you have an orchid named after you that you've smuggled into the country.
Yeah. And so, this grand jury's impaneled in Tampa. The FBI, or rather the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, sends agents to raid the guy's greenhouse in Virginia. They start sending subpoenas to the scientists at Selby Gardens. I mean, it's just Peru actually made a formal diplomatic complaint to the United States over it. So it became an international incident. I mean, just all kinds of trouble stemmed from this one flower. So
from the
yes,
flower.
Yeah, there were lots of puns in that book.
Yeah, as there should be.
I like even the title is "The Scent of Scandal."
Yes.
Very evocative.
I wanted to call it a whiff of scandal, but the publisher said nobody knows what a whiff is.
And then the alliteration is also pretty good.
Yes,
so.
yes, they like that. Yeah.
My favorite thing, the reason we included this question is because your Wikipedia claims that it's the only true crime gardening book.
That is true. On the back of the book, you can see it's classified as true crime / gardening, which I'm sure the bookstore people have a hard time figuring out which shelf to put that on.
Maybe it's a way of they can't decide, so they put it on both. So you've got double visibility in the store. Go. Twice as much chance for people to see it.
What's your favorite subject that you've covered in your career?
Probably the Panthers. I love writing about the Panthers. It's to me, they're endlessly fascinating, and their story is just an amazing one. I mean, we sort of left off with the school children voting them as the state animal, and they nearly went extinct after that. They were down to about 20 in the mid 90s, and their numbers are so small they were inbreeding, so there were these terrible genetic defects. Yeah. So that basically they were circling the drain, and they tried to do a captive breeding project, but all the kittens that they brought in from the wild to raise to do captive breeding, they all turned out to have the same genetic defects. So that would not be a solution. And they were banging their heads against the wall thinking, what are we going to do? And so they had a meeting at the White Oak Plantation up near Jacksonville. And everybody's throwing ideas around, and someone, and nobody remembers exactly who it was, said, what if we bring in a close cousin of the panther? What if we send Roy McBride? This guy's all through the story. What if we send Roy back to Texas to capture some female cougars? Not the ones from Cougar Town from the TV show, but the cougars, and bring them to Florida and turn them loose to breed with the male panthers. And maybe that's a way we can refresh the gene pool. And so that's what they did. And they released female cougars from Texas, healthy female cougars, and 5 of them produced kittens that were free of the genetic defects. And as a result, they had a baby boom, and there are now about 200 roaming through what's left of the wilderness in Florida. So I contend it's the biggest comeback of an American endangered species since the passage of the Endangered Species Act. And it's set an example that they're trying with other species now. To try and, basically to refresh a poor gene pool by bringing in a similar species that can breed with them.
Have you ever seen one in the wild?
Not in the wild, no. I've seen several in captivity, but not in the wild. I'd love to see one, but they're mostly nocturnal and I guess crepuscular. Mm-hmm. Is that the term? And so you can't plan to see one. I guess
no,
is the way to put it.
Yes.
I've seen a track. That's the closest I've gotten.
Probably the most endangered species that I've seen in person is the ghost orchid.
Cool.
But but no, I've never seen a panther in the wild. I'd love to see one. If you have one in your back pocket, pull it out. Let me see it.
I was asking because I would love to see one too. I mean, with all my time being in Florida, trips to the Everglades, camping in the Everglades and stuff, never have seen one. And I mean, they're just so. It's like you said, you can't plan it. It's just you got to be in the right place at the right time, and you get lucky.
Exactly.
We've got some listener questions for you.
Oh, okay.
Kale wants to know, which is more dangerous, walking barefoot through the Everglades or barefoot through a 7-Eleven?
I know what I think.
Is the 7-Eleven located in Pasco County? I think that's my key question.
Okay. Yeah. And then Gregory asked, what are the lessons to be taken from conserving Florida in the midst of heavy development?
The lessons. Well, I think, it's interesting. I was in Venice, which is a town in Sarasota County, last night, and had some dinner with some people there, and they were complaining about the congestion, the terrible congestion in the roads there. That overdevelopment has led to serious traffic congestion and other problems as well. When the hurricanes hit, it caused rampant flooding and in places that had never flooded before, because now the wetlands that should have soaked up the floodwaters aren't there anymore. They've been built over. And so these folks who clearly benefited from the overdevelopment because they were living in a fairly, like a 20-year-old development project, they were complaining about what the new folks were doing. And so I think it's important for us to preserve some of the most important properties for our own health and well-being and lifestyle, in order to make sure that we don't become the victims of overdevelopment. And it's not just a mental health thing. For me, it is. The way you kind of recovered from dealing with some of the crazy traffic here, to me, is head for one of the parks, head for a hiking trail, but head for a canoe trail. But I think it's important for our overall health, and of course for clean water. We need to preserve the wetlands, because they filter out all the pollution in the water before it goes into our underground aquifer. And so that's pretty important as well. But, a lot of the development is being done by fly-by-night companies that they want to come in and make their profit and then get out and not even worry about building all the amenities that they're supposed to build. They start selling the lots before they built the sewer plant,
Yeah.
Right.
Overloading the system in a big way.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And then we have a hurricane hit and massive sewage leaks and sewage spills and flesh-eating bacteria. Florida had the most cases of flesh-eating bacteria last year, more than any other state, and it's all hurricane related because of all the sewage spills that happened as a result of the hurricanes.
Crazy. Put that on the state sign.
Yeah. Somehow the Chamber of Commerce never mentions that when they're running the ads.
Maybe we could put out a survey for the kids and in schools and say, what do you think the state's bacteria should be? And then one of the good contenders.
There you go. That's good.
Help raise awareness.
If you want to lose weight, come to Florida. We've got flesh-eating bacteria.
Yeah.
It's better than Ozempic.
The weight falls right off of you.
What are you working on now?
I got a new book coming out in March. It's called Welcome to Florida, True Tales from America's Most Interesting State. It's a collection of columns and stories that I've written over the last 4 or 5 years. And so there's, pieces in there about cowboys, nudists, alligators, the citrus industry, Tim Dorsey, the usual stuff.
That pretty much just perfectly summarizes Florida. If someone can summarize Florida in 5 words, that's what it is. You don't even have
to say the state; everyone knows.
Yeah.
Right.
And it's got a cover. Like my last book was a collection similar to that called "The State You're In." Both books have this terrific cover by Andy Marlette, who's an editorial cartoonist and native who lives up in Pensacola. So he does a terrific job. I'm a huge fan of his. I think it does. I think his drawings do more to sell the book than my name on the cover.
It's probably 50-50.
Yeah, it works. It's a synergy where 2 + 2 then equals 7. The sum is greater than the total of its parts.
Yeah, I'm not good at math. I thought that was what it equaled already.
That's the Florida education system for you.
Well, Craig, thanks for coming on today. If anyone listening would like to support the show, you can do so at patreon.com/wildgreenmemes. That's memes with an M. If you sign up by January 31st, 2025, we'll send you the Year of the Frog calendar, which is full of memes and fun facts and fake fun facts about frogs. All of our music is by RX Fire. Until next time, I'm Rhett.
I'm Io.
And I'm Craig.
And happy Year of the Frog.
Ribbit, ribbit.